Hello, Jeando.
Hi, Kevin. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. So we've talked about in previous videos, we talked about faulty sensory appreciation. So what is faulty sensory appreciation and how does that connect with an important principle of F.M. Alexander's, the means whereby principle?
Well, yes, we discussed last time habits, and we started to mention that the center, what is the motivation of habits is in fact what we call faulty sensory appreciation. Is that we get into the habit of performing an act, and we perform that act according to the feeling the act is supposed to provide us, which means that we are completely adjusted to what we feel as right for us is right. So that's a very, very complex situation, because when you start learning a technique, so a technique is a system of construction. We are not discussing poetry. We are not discussing the use of language in order to create nice ideas, nice dreams. No, technical means that we use speech in order to construct physical realities, physical reactions. So what happens is that the notion of habits and faulty sensory appreciation is a vast subject. But Alexander is very organized in some ways, and we don't get lost into this vast field, because he's got a hierarchy of ideas to, in fact, organize and plan or discovery of that vast field. And we want, of course, to make a new journey. We want to, in fact, see things in different lights from what is habitual to us, of course. That was the principle, the idea of change, the idea of not continuing to do the same thing in the same way all the time, but discovering new things, what Alexander called the unknown. And what is unknown for him is an act or reaction that is not performed according to what feels habitual, to what feels correct to us. So in order to map the territory, Alexander is using what I call a system of concepts. And in this system of concepts, of course, we will see faulty sensory appreciation. But the center of the system is not faulty sensory appreciation. Everything does not start with faulty sensory appreciation. Alexander has a technical concept, and the technical concept is called the means whereby principle. So when we say it's a principle, what we mean is that it's a concept of a hierarchy. It's like the center of all the concepts, and all the concepts are going to relate to that one. So Alexander invented a instrumental concept. It's not simply to describe what it is we are doing, how we are doing it. It's also a concept that is instrumental in the sense that it's the solution to create new, unknown reaction to habitual acts. So the means whereby principle. What is the center, or does not say to us where we start. Alexander started with observing himself in a mirror. And what he observed in a mirror is what we call positions. That is a number of movements occurring at the same time, and performed in such a way that a position can be seen. And he quickly found and defined the first idea. It's related to the means whereby principle. Why is there a means whereby principle? Is because he found that his manner of reaction in certain habitual acts was provoking positions of mechanical disadvantage. So it's very important to start with this. These movements occurring at the same time that they form the mechanism of the torso. That's what he saw in the mirror. He saw that the mechanism of the torso, of course, is articulated. There are different parts, different bony parts that can move relatively to one another. And he found that when he was subject to any stimulus of disequilibrium, that is physical or mental, he would react in a way that tended to, in fact, provoke organized movements of the different parts of the torso that were leading to faulty positions. What is faulty position? Well, it's very simple. The faulty position is a position that will shorten, contract the torso. So from this idea, he found that the reason these positions of faulty mechanical advantage were appearing were because the movements that he made and provoked these positions felt right. It felt right to react to a disequilibrium in that way. And so he could do no other thing at first. He needed an instrumental idea in order to change from this reaction that produced these movements leading to a position of mechanical disadvantage to a position of mechanical advantage. So sensory appreciation, or feelings and impressions about what we are doing with the different parts of all the mechanism, is faulty in the sense that it produces positions of mechanical disadvantage of the mechanism of the torso. It's very important to understand that. Alexander found that his voice problem came from the fact that the voice mechanism is powered by the breathing system, which is inside the mechanism of the torso. And if what he was doing with his feet, because he found that the origin of the problem of voice that he suffered from was from a very strange order given by one of his teachers of elocution that say, take hold of the floor with your foot, with your feet. And Alexander, in order to imitate and in order to apply the instructions, well, was in fact producing movements in the legs and feet that induced a faulty organization of the mechanism of the torso. And as a result, first of all, was impairing his breathing mechanism, but also because the torso is supporting the voice mechanism, were creating faulty condition of functioning for the voice mechanism. And he was getting sore throat and incapacity of emitting sound. So faulty sensory appreciation is not just the fact that I do not feel correctly. It's very interesting to ask the question, when is sensory appreciation really faulty? And Alexander had a knack at creating procedures that would, in fact, bring to light the faulty sensory appreciation. Bring to light the fact that in these conditions, he was proposing as a mechanical problem, or what we call a psycho-mechanical problem, because you have to think how to solve the problem he's proposing. And you find that in these conditions, your feelings are telling you, your feelings are shrieking, are shouting to you that no, it's what we are trying to do is not possible. I need to do the movements that I use habitually and that involve an enormous amount of muscular activity and contraction and shortening. And so when you experiment with this kind of procedure, well, some people say, I am confronted with faulty sensory appreciation. No, You just start to have a look at what it is that is directing your movement, that is guiding your movements. And you find that what is guiding your movement is not reasoned. So the means whereby principle as a fundamental concept that is just beneath the means whereby principle is the concept of reason inhibition. And reason inhibition is directly related with these movements that occur when you're guided by faulty sensory appreciation, is that you need to learn how to stop giving consent to these faulty movements. That's the big part of the means whereby principle, is to realize that we have a habit at coordinated movements together. The idea is not to stop one movement. The idea is to look at the series of movements we are performing under the guidance of sensory appreciation. And you think, oh dear, when I do, for example, want to get out of my chair, I am at the same time sending, for example, my knees and the middle and top of the torso forward. Is it possible then to think, okay, to stand, if you reason, you will find that the movement of the knee should be to go back, because standing is very simply extending the legs. When you're sitting, your legs are flexed. When you're standing, your legs are extended. So if you reason 1 second about going from sit to stand, you will find that the trajectory of the knee is clear. It should be clear, is that the knee should go back. Easy. Okay, then you have to test yourself to see what is happening at the moment when you decide to rise off the chair. And you will find that your sensory appreciation is telling you to bend the knees even more than they are, in order like to get the momentum. Because there are justification for faulty sensory appreciation. Sensory appreciation is not something of the body, and there is the mind that is thinking reasonable thoughts. No. Faulty sensory appreciation is not a body thing. It's a mind it's a mind representation. I represent in my mind that I need to follow my feelings in order to achieve this gesture. So faulty sensory appreciation is of the mind. And so when we say we want to inhibit a faulty movement, it's also a question of the mind. The body in here just plays a part of the performance. We want to see whether it's possible, using the means whereby principle, to pass from a position of mechanical disadvantage in the reaction to a position of mechanical advantage in the reaction. This idea of using the word position of mechanical advantage is not advantageous in itself, because most people have this idea that a position is a fixed organization. For Alexander, he's not thinking like that. I have to repeat to my student time and time again. No, Alexander is not thinking of the fixed position compared to flowing movements, or differentiated from flowing movement. Is talking of position of mechanical advantage in walking, in going up and down stairs. And explain to me how walking, for example, running with a position of mechanical advantage could be fixed. It's, so the means whereby principle, I said, rest on this idea, the first idea of a reason inhibition of unwanted movements. These movements are unwanted because we have reason what could be a position of mechanical advantage. Very simply, an expansion of the torso. So if I see that in the process of rising from the chair, I shorten the mechanism of the torso, it means that the movements that are composing this gesture are guided by faulty sensory appreciation. Well, all this rests on the capacity to demonstrate that it is possible to solve the riddle of standing with a position of mechanical advantage, of course. Alexander was capable of doing that. We have a few photos and a film that is showing him just performing the simple act of rising from a chair without sending the upper torso forward in space. So there was evidence that it was possible, and I could just realize that he was performing a gesture that was beyond my capacity. All I could see when I tried to imitate the same trajectory in space is that for me, it was just impossible. There was no way my organism would perform what he was showing. I was quite muscular. I was quite coordinated. I had 3 years of training course with the modern Alexander technique. And yet, wow, incredible. I found that what Alexander called the frog dance, that I will explain in a minute, was just unbelievable. How could he do such thing? And on top, when he's doing it, he's 81 and he had a stroke 2 years before. I was young, I was fit, I thought I was re-educated with the modern Alexander technique. I had many touch lessons, and no way was it possible for me to rise in the way he was showing on screen. So that's where we touch another aspect of the means whereby principles. Alexander explained that the means whereby principle involved this idea that any gestures that we make, so any position, any movement that we make, involve concerted orders of movements. The different bony parts of the torso have to move relatively to one another and relatively to some guidance outside, having a relationship with the world around, which makes equilibrium. And if the position that we assume is a position of faulty mechanical advantage, then it means that the movements are themselves badly coordinated. So it's necessary to imagine a projection of concerted orders of movements. You have to stop performing the movement as feel right, and that can only be objectively assessed by looking at yourself working on video. Because when you're performing the gesture yourself, you have only your sensory appreciation to evaluate what you're doing. What are the movements you are making with the ankle, with the knees, with the hips, with the lower part, middle part, and upper part of the torso, with the arms. There is no way. What we feel is not what we are doing, we do. It's just a fact, and that fact can only be realized by people when they start having lessons, when they start to see to what level they are influenced by what they feel. And for example, during a gesture, I often point to them with words saying, you have brought the middle torso forward and you have really braced the upper torso back. And the person had no recollection, no awareness that she had done any such thing. For her, well, she was just continuing to lengthen the torso, for example. So the projection of concerted orders to obtain a position of mechanical advantage are orders of movements. You have to understand that, for example, lengthening the back or lengthening the torso involved projecting a series of movement to the different parts of the torso. When we say projecting a movement, it's the idea beyond these words are that we have to conceive the movements first. we have to imagine that it's possible to move the middle of the torso relatively to the extremities. And we have to map in our mind in which direction we want to go with all the parts at the same time, so that to change the shape. If when we are performing, we are shortening the torso any which way, it's absolutely clear that if we do project new concerted movements that will tend to lengthen the torso, we are going to feel that we are curving in the opposite direction. We have to understand that our sensory appreciation is adapted to the past. And if we feel straight when we are curved, well, it means that if we want to change, and if we want to use means whereby orders of movement in order to change, the first effect we are going to discover is that we are, in fact, dictating to curve the torso when we want it to be flat and lengthening. That's a consequence of the system where the means whereby orders of inhibition and orders of definite performance are systematically against what we feel, because what we feel is based on the past. And what we are projecting is a new organization that can only be of the future. So Alexander said time is of the essence of this idea of new technical understanding and technical realization that we can change our habits of reaction. And this is exactly how I started, in fact, to, well, think for myself and solve this problem. So it's quite important now to go back to, first of all, the means whereby principle, and to see what Alexander is saying about it. And this is a sentence that I really like, because I think is very clear in defining the means whereby principle. And I wanted to bring that sentence to you, because there are many ideas that are promoted by the modern Alexander technique, but I don't think that their conception of the means whereby is the same as the one you're going to hear now. So this sentence comes from the use of the self. It's not an early writing. It's the third book. And Alexander was just starting the teacher training course that has led to what we know now as the modern Alexander technique. And what is important here is the concept of unity in the working of the human organism, as you will see. And I will tell you the sentence, and after that, I will start and explain what I think Alexander is conveying, what form of idea is conveying. So here is what Alexander says. Now, if we understand the means whereby principle, on which the teacher will adheres to the idea of unity in the working of the human organism will base his teaching method, we must recognize that the attainment of any desired end or the performance of any act involves the direction and performance of a connected series of preliminary acts by means of the mechanism of the organism. And that therefore, if the use of the mechanism is to be directed so as to result in the satisfactory attainment of the desired end, the directions, that is the orders for this use, must be projected in a connected series to correspond with the connected series of preliminary acts. So this is in the use of the self, and it's page 38. So if we are to understand the means whereby principle, we have to deal with a very long sentence. So let's see what Alexander is saying. So he says that we have this idea of the unity of the working of the human organism. So the unity in the working of the human organism is the unity in reaction. And what is the unity in reaction? It's the unity of the physical and mental parts. That is, for Alexander, any act, any movement any position that we assume because there is a unity between our understanding of the requirement of the position and the physical performance of the different movements that will realize the position. What it involves is that if we have a very somatic, subconscious, feeling representation of the gesture, well, the process of performing the gesture is going to be according to that very elementary intellectual representation. So what it means is that it's going to be very difficult to intervene and change anything, because if we have just a subconscious representation, let's say you've been moved by someone time and time again, so you are so surprised, you feel lifted, you feel like light and free. It's fantastic. Well, it's a fantastic feeling. It's a fantastic subconscious experience. But nothing says that you are feeling a fantastic lightness because everything is working right. You just feel a fantastic feeling of lightness, that's all. And so if you want to, by yourself, improve and change even more, you will find that you're stuck. You're stuck because you have no representation of the different preliminary acts and connected series of preliminary acts that have been performed in order for you to assume the new position. So any act makes the different parts of the torso move relatively to one another. The idea is that we want to start to control these different movements. We want to start to make sure that we can, first of all, represent in our mind what sort of connected series of preliminary acts we want to see performed, and what connected series of preliminary acts are against, because I said before that when we are subjected to a strong stimulus, our tendency is to react by a connected series of preliminary acts that leads to a position of mechanical disadvantage. So all this idea of means whereby principle as a background, always this representation of what is a position of mechanical advantage and what is not. So when I reached this point, and I started to see that what I had learned in the modern Alexander technique had nothing to do with that. It was a somatic training. Alexander is not talking about a somatic training, of course. And so I started to pinpoint the necessity to understand what is a position of mechanical advantage. What makes a position mechanical different from a position of mechanical disadvantage. And I started to look at FM Alexander's video. I started to look at what could be the performance of sitting down or standing up from a chair with position of mechanical advantage. And I saw that I saw in his video that when he was leaning forward with the whole torso, when he was stopping, when he was then rising, well, it was absolutely obvious that his torso was organized with different movements compared to mine, because his torso stayed expanded all the time. So that is the idea for the orders that for this use that must be projected in a connected series. It's not just thinking, okay, I'm going to rise with an expanding torso, because this never works. You want to rise with an expanding torso, you're going to inhibit, you're going to direct with your old inhibition orders, or neck free, head forward, and up, back to lengthen and widen. And when you check on video, when you observe what it is you're doing, well, you find you're not doing the expansion of the torso. There are many things that are showing that, in fact, no. And you are not even inhibiting the throwing forward of the torso to stand. So these are technical aspects, and they need like a technical setting, what I call a control procedure, for people really to realize, because it's so easy to delude oneself, especially after a long training of the modern Alexander technique, to delude oneself that one is as a sensory appreciation that has been re-educated, and that now we are a different person and we are moving with flow, we are moving with ease. Well, okay, we can have a sensory appreciation that is really getting stronger and telling us that we are doing everything with ease. But when you start to measure, then things get a bit more complicated, and you can start to really pinpoint where you are not inhibiting the faulty habitual movement that you're always doing. And you're still doing them after many, many years of training, or many, many years of somatic manipulation and body knowledge transmission. So that's why Alexander used procedures in the means whereby system of conscious guidance and control. There is always this idea of procedures. So I started to look at Alexander, and I found that for example, he had procedures, and these were pedagogical procedures. So I started to look at, for example, when he was going from stand to sit, or from sit to stand, what were the characteristics of position of mechanical advantage. Alexander is seen to lean forward. And when I started to experiment and try and understand what it is we mean by lengthening the torso, well, I found a peculiar shape that was very different from mine. He had a very long thoracolumbar junction, meaning that it was absolutely obvious that he was lengthening the lower back. At the same time, there was an absolutely obvious what he called hump, that is the primary thoracic curve was really preserved, so that the head was very, very far forward from the line of the back. And another thing struck me, and I started to have a clear idea of how to reproduce and test what he was talking about. And I started to notice that the distance from the front of the ankle and the distance from a vertical reference, and the distance from the top of the torso, the sternum bone, and the vertical reference was nearly the same. So I started to, in fact, verify that the angle of his torso relatively to the vertical was always the same, in between 19 and 21 degrees. So I said to myself, well, it's very simple. I'm just going to start measuring, controlling with objective measures whether I am reproducing the procedure as he describes it. So I am seeing here in standing, and the distance from the front of the ankle to a wall is made the same as the distance from the stroke to the wall. at first, when you start experimenting with this, you will see how it clashes with your sensory appreciation. You have the impression when you are in this type of organization of the torso relatively to the point of contact with the floor that you're falling backward. Alexander is not falling backward, but I certainly had an immense impression that this was not sustainable. I could not stand like this. It was very funny. And so I discovered that if I wanted to stand in that way, it was necessary for me to organize different movements of the part in order to get a forward momentum to compensate for the backward momentum that I felt. And that was real. It's absolutely clear that if you compare where is the ankle, where is the torso, you will see that 9/10 of the torso is backward relative to the ankle. Who would not feel unbalanced in this gesture? No one. So if the person is able to perform such an equilibrium game, it means that there is something to compensate for the backward momentum that is, in fact, brought about by the position of the thorax relatively to the ankle. So it started to become more technical. And there is nothing about flow, about thinking that the floor is flowing and supporting you. No, you need movements. You need to, and what is very problematic is that the movements are not visible. You can only see the results of the movements. Most people would say there is no movements here, because the person, for example, is just squatting and staying in place. So there is nothing obvious. What we call normally movement is that something is moving somewhere and I can see that in time there is a change in position. No, this is a quasi-static situation where if you can project movements of the different parts, you will be able to achieve that equilibrium. If you're just trying to stay there, you will just fall. So I had to confront myself with this idea of potential movements that in physics is very easy to understand, but when it comes to moving the different parts of one's own body, well, we are against the full blow of the force of our sensory appreciation that is telling us, no way, you cannot. So in this case, using a ruler, it's easier because you can tell yourself, I am moving my throat forward in space so that it stays connected with the ruler and the wall. If the throat goes away from the wall, well, it means obviously that there is a movement moving the throat backward. And so you can start then to realize that, okay, there is some force that is provoking the movement backward. I can give consent to it. If I want to refuse to give consent to that movement, refusing as an inhibition decision is not going to work, especially when you're going to move up and down, because then the stimulation is so strong that just refusing has no effect. You just fall backward. So you need to change and think, okay, if I want to refuse to go back with that spot, I must, in my mind, organize a conscious instruction of movement forward. That conscious movement of direction forward is just going to, in fact, maintain the structure in the same type of equilibrium. So we arrive at this idea of an equilibrium that is not a position, that is a result of concerted movements. So when you reach that spot, then you can start to understand Alexander's procedure, because Alexander is explaining, for example, a procedure where you can test your sensory appreciation. It's a procedure that is very common And that is an interest for Alexander. It's something out of ordinary activity that you do perform every single day, maybe 200 times a day or more. So it's a very interesting area of exploration, of discovery. And he's explaining in Man's Supreme Inheritance a procedure to go from stand to sit and sit to stand. So I'm just going to explain what he says about the procedure from sit to stand. So you have a person that is sitting on a chair, of course, with the feet on the floor. And he says, let the whole body come forward. So you're sitting on a chair with the feet on the floor, and when he says let the whole body come forward, you have to understand that most of the time when he says the word body, it's not in the same sense as we use nowadays. For us, the body is the body mind. No. Let the whole body means the whole torso. So he says let the whole torso come forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet. I'm stopping right there because how do you know that the center of gravity falls over the feet? Because as I've demonstrated just a second ago, when we are leaning forward with the torso, how far do we lean in order to get the center of gravity fall over the feet? So in order to solve that problem, I just took Alexander's organization of the parts when he was sitting, leaning forward or squatting, because you will see it's the same thing, the frog, what you call the frog dance. And I said, well, that is what he calls the moment when he can rise from the chair. So if this is the moment when he considers that he can rise from the chair, I will consider that this is the moment when the whole torso comes forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet. While when I assume the same position, I have the neat impression, unmistakable impression, that if someone was to come and take the chair away, I would fall backward. I would not be poised. I would not be balanced. There is so much weight backward that so it was like a funny situation, because Alexander says let the whole body come forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet. Well, when you look at him performing that action, you think, no, it's not possible. What is this? How can you stay balanced if somebody takes the chair away and not fall back when your throat is at the same distance from a wall than your instep? You're falling backward. Your sensory appreciation is telling something. Alexander is performing something that is showing something else. The same sentence, the center of gravity fall over the feet, as two completely different representation, whether you follow Alexander's representation of a position of mechanical advantage, or you follow what you feel. So some people think that Alexander's book are not explanatory, that they are not providing information, that all the information come from the somatic feeling. This is a very, very good example to show that it's exactly wrong to think in that way. Let the whole body, torso, come forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet, according to Alexander. According to the geometric definition that we can take out of his representation of the movement. So he adds, until the poise is such that if the chair were removed at this point, you would be left balanced in the position of a person performing the frog dance. So I look at the picture of Alexander performing the frog dance. I look at the skeleton so far back. I look at the throat forward, and I say, well, fine. I need to find a way to create that position. So the way to create the position is the means whereby to perform the position. And the means whereby to perform the position is a combination of different movements for the ankle, different movement for the knees, different movement for the different parts of the torso, and even different movement for the arm. Because in order to stay balanced there and not fall backward, you need to bring everything into movement, into play. Otherwise, you just fall backward. And he says, so you're left balanced in this position where if the chair was taken away, you will just stay balanced performing the frog dance. So what is the frog dance? Well, the frog dance is simply what is represented by Alexander squatting. He is balanced, he is like a frog. And when you're left balanced like this, like in a very high squat, you're not falling backward or forward. And if you want to rise, if you want to go up, well, I've noticed that if a person is squatting in this way, the person will never, go backward, that's clear, because then you would fall, you're on the brink of equilibrium. And the person will never go forward either. The person will keep equilibrium and just rise vertically. And Alexander says, and that's a very, very problematic part of the sentence, then you are left balanced in a position of a person performing a frog dance. Then by the exercise of the muscles of the leg and back, straighten the legs at the hips, knees, and ankles until the erect position is perfectly attained. What is problematic here? Well, it's problematic because Alexander is saying by the exercise of the muscles of the legs and back. Alexander does not mean the muscles, the contraction of the muscle, by the exercise of the tissues of the leg and back would have been much more, much less potentially problematic. Because most people, when they think of exercise of the muscle, they think of co-contraction. They think of making an effort. They think of trying to lift the weight. When if you are already in a position of equilibrium, it means that the means whereby movement going forward and going back are exactly balanced. And because they are exactly balanced, what will happen is that you will simply release upward. This feeling need of making oneself go up cannot be there. It's as simple as that. And Alexander adds, and that's the part on faulty sensory appreciation, on the faulty habit. If you care to experiment with a friend in this act of rising, you will observe that in the movement, the whole movement, as performed by an imperfectly coordinated person, the same bad movements occur, tending to stiffen the neck, to arch the spine unduly, to shorten the body, and to protrude the abdominal wall. The person has a need. The person has a need to launch the rising. The person must find force. Well, when the force should already be there. If there was no chair, the person will be in space, and the force that lifts the body up is already there. There is no need to find extra force to rise. But that is theory. That is just impossible for the imperfectly coordinated person. When we say imperfectly coordinated person, we mean, Alexander, I think, means that there is an imperfect coordination between the means whereby orders projection which is a mental thing, and the body performance, which we would call more or less a physical performance. The coordination is, of course, the faulty coordination of the different movements, because what we see are movements that stiffen the neck, arch the spine, shorten the body, shorten the torso, protrude the abdominal wall. In rising, that's what the person is doing. So I inquired into this, and I came to a series of orders that I could project myself, and inhibiting all these movements that felt absolutely necessary. So I found that there were many movements required, new movements, and there were so many that I had no time or no space in my mind to, in fact, focus on feeling. So it was like standing without feeling. I was thinking of other things than what I felt. I was discarding what I felt. And as a result of that, I started to experiment the frog dance. As if you are sitting, you're leaning the torso forward. I wanted to make sure that the torso, so I'm going to show you a video. I started with this idea of being able to, in fact, create the frog dance position. So create the different types of series of movements that were necessary to have the throat, the top of the sternum, and the front of the ankle at exactly the same distance from the wall. So that was a way to, in fact, make sure that I could monitor, control the angle of the torso to the vertical all the time. And the control was, of course, posterior. I would make the gesture and then look at the video and see whether I had been able to continue to lengthen the torso and keep the same relationship of the frog dance. You will see that the angle I was able to perform at the time, that is, I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, is 21.2. Alexander is at 19. I'm still working at improving this, but around 20 is very near the mark. Yes. So what we see here is that this is the reference I was looking at, I was wanting to obtain, and this is the video. So I am talking here, and to show that the torso is already inclined forward, and it's already at the correct distance. Everything is ready. So at one moment, just there is the rising. It's very simple. There is no effort. Everything is already prepared. Just rising without, in fact, shortening the mechanism of the torso. This is mechanical advantage in action. When I started to be able to perform this action, I started to, well, really recognize that there was, in fact, truth in this idea of conscious guidance and control. It was possible to bypass the faulty sensor appreciation that is, in fact, the ingredient that is molding our habits, and start expanding the mechanism of the torso in any gestures, in sitting, standing, going from sit to stand. And that is why going from sit to stand is such an elementary, basic academic work in the Alexander technique. It's because with going from sit to stands, all the habits are there. When the person is going to sit, for example, Alexander explained that what you want is you want to incline the torso, lean the torso. So you will, of course, lean the torso by going back with the back, not forward with the knees. You go back. And then you just ask yourself a simple question. Are the sitting bones above the chair? If you've gone back with the lower torso, of course they are. So you're safe. You're safe. You can measure the angle of the back of the torso to the vertical. You can see where you are. And if you use rulers, for example, you make absolutely sure that the throat has not gone forward in space because there is a ruler against the wall. And then, being safe, the only instruction is to, Alexander explained, use the hips, knees, and ankle as hinges. And you should, in fact, move downward toward the chair, respecting exactly the same 21-degree or 20-degree geometry with the torso. It's very, very graphic. You can or you cannot. And you discover that when you cannot, it's because some movements have appeared, which we call unwanted movement. These are the movements we want to refuse to give consent to. That is what we call the orders of definite inhibition of the unwanted subconscious movement that are produced. It's like peeling an onion, because at first you will see only gross unwanted movements appearing. And it's quite fast to get rid of the gross unwanted movement. But when we work together, we've passed the time when we are stopping gross unwanted movement. We want these very tiny, like microscopic unwanted movement, but still they have to be inhibited, because if you don't, well, the geometry is not a geometry of an expanding torso. So the technique is not for fun. I mean, some people, they like to release and to feel better. Well, we are very far from this way of understanding a technical approach to habits. The technical approach to habits is very, very serious. Well, I am often criticized for being too serious. No, this is not too serious. A technique is technical by definition. So you need ways to, in fact, understand mechanisms. You need ways to instruct the movements you want the mechanism to perform. And of course, you need ways to control the mechanism. I'm just stating these obvious facts to relate the mechanism, this idea of means whereby principle, in order to organize the functioning of the mechanism according to conscious guidance and control system of lessons. That's the idea. So I hope that this will make a little bit clearer this idea of faulty sensory appreciation, how it relates to the means whereby principle, and how we can, in fact, because of the means whereby principle, start to explore how you can detach yourself from the guidance of the feeling, that is the somatic cognition that has been the start of our understanding of our practice of the use of that self, that mechanism that is the self, but that is now well, producing unwanted results. Of course, somatic cognition is important for a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, because the 1-year-old or 2-year-old cannot, of course, use reasoning in order to decide and in order to make decisions that are not based on feeling. Of course, yeah, somatic cognition is important for babies, but for people like us, for adults, living in a very complex world where our decisions are very important, because the decision to sit in a certain way now is going to have repercussion. My decisions of breathing, for example, we are in the period of the COVID-19 quarantine at the moment, and everything that can make us create a new organization of the torso and promote an expansion of the breathing movements is potentially life-saving. It's very important to understand that most people are just thinking that Alexander technique and breathing are related. In the next video, I will show you how little true that is and how necessary we need to understand the mechanism that we are talking about. It's good to have an idea that one is breathing well. It's better to be able to control whether the movements that are associated with it and the movement that Alexander has shown are effectively produced when we do what we think is the Alexander Technique breathing system, which I don't think it is. Is that clear?
That is very clear. It's fantastic, Jeando. And for anyone who's watching this video, they might want to film themselves sitting down and standing up, and compare it to the video we saw of you earlier, and you'll notice that you're probably doing something very different. Or to watch someone, your friend or a family member, stand and sit, and you could begin to explore what some of the movements they should and shouldn't be doing from looking at the video.
Yes, you make a good point here, because I've seen many teachers that at first, when seeing the frog dance procedure, thought, well, yes, and what? It's easy. And when you start to measure, to use, for example, a ruler to make sure that you are respecting the angle that Alexander is showing as a position of mechanical advantage, that is, you're not throwing yourself forward very far. 21 degrees or 20 degrees is not very far. I can tell you, when you will start to just watch Alexander do it, and just watch yourself do it, you will find that it's absolutely enormous. Well, I mean, in the sense that nobody can accept that at first. And why is it possible? Well, it's not. It's because we are not talking about muscles. We are Alexander, when he's performing it on video, is 81 after a stroke, and it's not muscles. It's how you will expand the elastic tissues of the back and the back of the legs and the back of the ankle all together, that will provide an enormous elastic resistance that is going to catapult yourself in the air. If you don't get the antagonistic pulls working for you, there is no way you can obtain the position of mechanical advantage as demonstrated by Alexander. So when you do perform, just use a simple piece of wood, a little ruler, and make sure that you set your ankle and the top of your throat at the same distance from a wall. That will ensure that in sitting you will be near the 21 degrees and the lengthening. And well, the lengthening that is required to, in fact, get the antagonistic pulls is something to be obtained. It's not something that you have. You have to be patient. You have to realize that you cannot, on the first try, perform that gesture. It's the tissues, the elastic tissues respond to work, which means that if you, without knowing it, have shortened the torso every single time you are going up or down, well, these structures are not yet ready to promote the activities that is necessary to rise in the way Alexander is rising. That's why I showed that the angle I was able to perform on the video is not the angle Alexander is performing. And there's very little difference, but I can tell you, I've been working at getting these 1.5 degrees for a few years, and it's not there. So just to say that don't be afraid, because very often I've seen people when they discovered, yes, that it was what Alexander was doing was really something special that could only be mentally promoted, because the sensory appreciation cannot do anything near this. They've been distraught and said, well, I've spent many years training and I can't do anything, and it's past me. They just didn't want to hear about it. They wanted to hide it under the carpet, straight away, and go back to directing with light instructions. I'm free, or it's good to confront oneself with the Alexander procedure. It's good to knock at the problem. Don't think that, okay, this is going to be solved easy. No way. But it's very interesting to, in fact, discover everything that has to be discovered in order to perform the procedures as he does. There is a wealth of discovery on how to organize movements together, how to concert movement. All this business of coordination of movements is really encapsulated in the very simple procedure that anybody can do without special clothes, without, you need a chair and a wall, that's and a little ruler, yes, and a video, yes, and a video. You need to film yourself when you're doing it. So at first, film yourself when you're doing it from the side. The preferential sagittal position that Alexander was always taking to see whether you're protruding the abdomen, whether you need to reach forward with the middle torso, which we don't want. We want the back to stay back, and we want the upper torso to come forward, exactly as Alexander was explaining in the first training course.
Okay, fantastic, Jeando. There's some homework for everybody.
Yeah.
So have fun. And if anyone's interested for booking a lesson with Jeando, you'll find a link to his website and how to book a lesson underneath this video. And we'll talk about more of some of these ideas next week. Okay, thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin, and
You're
bye.
welcome. Bye-bye.